Hi folks, welcome to this week's episode of the Ask the R podcast, where we've got a real treat for you. In this week, we're going to be deep diving into listeners' questions. These questions have come flooding into me from all over our social media channels. So sit tight, let's dive in, let's see if we can solve some problems for people. Hi folks, welcome back to the Ask the R podcast. We're now well into December and it's not going to be long before all the local authorities shut down, if they haven't already. They're already just having conversations around the water cooler, thinking about Christmas turkey. They're not thinking about your applications. So in this episode, what I'm going to try and do is sprinkle a little bit of fairy dust across this, answer some listeners' questions, and hopefully help you get your planning back on track. So first, this. It's time for You Couldn't Plan It, the feature where me and my team have scoured the internet for stupid, silly and downright infuriating planning related facts. Let's go. So in this one, we've got an article here from the Yorkshire Post. This is actually from a couple of years back, but 1 year back actually, but I picked this because I think it's really relevant, because we see these applications coming across our desk all the time. And it says, landowner unaware, ! He needed planning permission for a 60-acre horse riding centre. I'm not too sure how you could not realise you needed that. Probably a question of not getting the right advice early on at the right point in the development process. So it says here, a landowner who transformed a 60-acre farm into a riding arena and livery centre business has said he was unaware he needed planning consent. In an unusual planning application to North Yorkshire Council, Gary, we'll call him, that is his name actually, I just don't want to say his surname, is seeking retrospective consent to retain stables he has built and to change the use of agricultural barns and land as a commercial livery and exercise arena. The application comes amid mounting concerns from non-agricultural developments on farmland across North Yorkshire, with MPs, community leaders and residents highlighting food security issues and calling for planners to protect existing farm land. We're seeing quite a lot of these, and it's an issue. So a lot of people are buying rural properties and they're hoping to put livery on there, whether it's for their own horses or whether it is for commercial reasons. One of the big problems now is biodiversity net gain. So this is where you have to obtain 10% improvement over the baseline. If you're maximising the amount of land available for the livery yard, it can become quite challenging to meet your B&G obligations on site. So a lot does depend on the size of the site. So I thought that was an interesting one just to have a quick look at there, because it is a very topical at the moment. So I have got a series of questions in here. Let me just pull it up. And the first one I've got here is from Brian. Doesn't tell me where he's from. And Brian says, what's the minimum sequence of tree/eco steps to stay on programme? What's the minimum sequence of tree eco steps to stay on programme? If you were live, Brian, I'd get you to say that in your own words, because it doesn't make an awful lot of sense, but I'm going to try and explain this. So essentially, I'm going to relate this to smaller sites. On larger projects, you follow the ROAVR design stages, but on a smaller site, it all really starts with a topographical survey. Particularly now, if you need arboricultural and ecological surveys, you're almost certainly going to need Biodiversity Net Gain as well. And there's a popular phrase in business: what you measure improves, and the same goes for planning applications. You need to make sure you've got a good baseline. So it all starts with a topographical survey. So we make sure that the vast majority of the surveys we get involved with, they've got a topographical survey. In fact, that's a service that we now offer through our managed services division. So get a topographical survey done early on. Once you've got the topographical survey, you've got that good baseline of data. What you can do then is you can get those tree and ecology surveys done. Notice nothing's been designed at this point, because you need to know what the constraints are. The topo, the tree, the ecology service, that all feeds into site layout, feeds into design integration, feeds into highways, flood risk assessment, all that kind of good stuff. So topo survey, then your tree and ecology surveys, then integrate into the design, start to do some design. Once you've got those designs built up, it may be then that you're starting to look at method statements. So how is the project actually going to be delivered on site? Because there might be ecological constraints to accessing the site. There might be seasonal constraints to accessing the site. We're then looking at pre-construction, so we're looking to see what time of the year we can carry out our de-veg and all of that kind of good stuff. And then finally we're probably onto monitoring. So that gives you a rough idea of the sort of the flow, but to my mind it's always topo survey, enablement surveys, so tree surveys, ecology surveys, flood risk assessments, maybe visualization, some visualization work at that stage as well. Then you start with the design. So that's that one there from Brian. Let's have a look. We've got one here. Who's that from? Freya. There's one here from Freya. What tree and eco services can developers outsource? What tree and eco services can developers outsource? I would always look to bring in a specialist company to manage all of this for you. So if you can get a managed service that will do all your surveys, or your tree protection fencing, your great crested newt fencing, your site clearance, your tree surgery, your landscape design, all of that kind of stuff. The BNG, which is becoming really, really important, which will feed into another question in a minute, then I would try and get a one-stop shop for that if you possibly can do, because otherwise you're just going to spend your entire life dealing with contractors. So before we go on and talk about a BNG, it's time for this.
It's time for tremendous facts. Oh yeah. Get ready to learn, and that's a fact. Tremendous facts.
I nearly sung then. Tremendous facts. Right, where are we? Let's have a look. Where have I got to on my list? On everyone's favourite feature with the best jingle ever. The giant sequoia can weigh over 2.7 million pounds, which is as much as 15 blue whales. What is 2.7 million pounds in kilos? Should we have a look? 2.7 million pounds in kilos. Let's have a look. What have we got? That is 1.2 million kilograms. Surely that. Well, I suppose that must be right, mustn't it? That's quite something. 1,224,700 kilos. That is a big tree. That is a very, very big tree. The scent of fresh cut grass or trees is actually a distress signal from the plant. No, I didn't know that. I suppose that does kind of make sense, doesn't it? Some trees can clone themselves, resulting in forests where every tree is genetically identical. Yeah, I'm fairly certain we have that in the north of Scotland with aspen. I could be totally lying, but I'm sure we did some drone survey work with a trust that was doing a lot of research into that in the past. Trees can hibernate or drastically slow their metabolism during extreme weather. There are trees that grow in salt water like mangroves, which use salt-excreting glands. Certain fig trees rely entirely on one species of wasp for pollination and vice versa. That is a terrible strategy, isn't it? I wonder if those fig trees will last long term. And we've got 2 more here. Some trees release chemicals to stunt the growth of nearby competitors, a tactic called allelopathy. I've said now. Kian's got to mark this as explicit. There we go. Or go all the way through to whatever the time is now, 9 minutes 44, and remove that word. There we go. In some forests, tree roots fuse together, sharing nutrients and strength. So there we go, folks. That is some
It's time for tremendous
facts. So there we go. Right, back to the question. So I've got one here from Lucy, and Lucy says, what does Lucy say? Lucy says, how does Biodiversity Net Gain, BNG, affect planning? We have, I don't know when this question came in, Lucy, but we've covered this pretty extensively on the podcast. But for those who are listening for the first time, BNG is a fairly new mechanism. It started sort of coming in around 2023, and it's really got up to speed during the later stages of 2024 and into 2025. And basically, what it means is you must show a 10% improvement in biodiversity through the planning process, through planting and habitat creation, and it's mandatory. There are some exemptions. So if your project is self-build and genuinely self-build, then that is an exemption. The local authority now, some local authorities are asking for BNG assessments to prove that you're exempt. So there may or may not be a cost saving there with the initial amount of survey work. I'll talk about what the survey work is in a moment. The other exemption is what's known as the de minimis exemption. So if there's less than 25 square metres of habitat on site or habitat affected on site, then you may be exempt as well. So an obvious one would be if you had a tarmac car park or a commercial property or something like that that you wanted to extend and there's no habitat, you would almost certainly be exempt. So what happens? Well, let me tell you what happens, Lucy. Essentially what happens with BNG is that if you're not having any other ecology or tree surveys carried out, and ecologists will do a desktop assessment anyway, because they need to look for things like priority habitats adjacent to the site, and then they will come out to site and they will map the site, and they will condition score any habitats on site. So it might be that you've got some trees on site and they need to collect some information on the quality of those trees. Maybe you've got some grassland and they need to condition score that and find out what it is. All of this information is added into a ginormous spreadsheet called the statutory biodiversity metric. And what happens within that spreadsheet is that there are all sorts of clever macros in there that look at the quality of all of these different habitats. We then feed in what your design proposals are, and it spits a load of numbers out of the end. And there's a couple of ways that you can meet your biodiversity net gain obligations. It can either be on site. So it may be that you can fence off part of the site and use that for BNG enhancements, or if you haven't got a lot of space on site, then it may be that you have to look at purchasing off-site credits, which can be hellishly expensive. So it makes small sites hellishly difficult to develop without some real creativity. What's the time? We've got time here maybe for one or two more. So where are we? Fred says, how does tree/ecology compliance affects costs and timelines? Well, the biggest costs, Fred, are usually when you don't do it at the right time. So I think one of the other questions, Brian, was around timing, and this is kind of similar really. Delays and redesigns usually tend to happen when the surveys are done out of sequence. They're done later on. So for instance, with a tree survey, it may be that everything's fine, you submit, it gets so far, the local authorities say, look, look, Fred, you need a tree survey to support your application. You have that tree survey done, and the rooting area of that tree is impacted by your extension or your house build or your garden room or whatever it is that you're doing. You then have to start looking at special construction techniques or changing your design or something like that, and that then obviously spirals with the cost. So we're often the harbinger of doom when we're doing surveys once there are already designs in place. You also need to sort of think about budgeting for potentially tree protection fencing, maybe some supervision and possibly some maintenance as well. So there we go. Let's have one more. There's no name on this one. This one says, what red flags signal likely tree or ecology problems on a site? To you or to the local authority, what red flags signal likely tree or ecology problems with a site? If I'm looking at a site before we've been commissioned for any surveys, I am looking for, is it urban, is it rural, is it landlocked? Are there any ponds within 500 metres? Are there any priority habitats adjacent to or nearby? Are there sort of suitable commuting routes or things like that could potentially cause a problem for the clients? I think from your perspective, maybe if you were looking to buy a site, if no surveys have been carried out, that would be a red flag for me. Also, sites that are being sold without planning consent in place, and you've got to do all of this, I would definitely get some very early advice as to whether this is going to be viable or not. So hopefully that is helpful. That is it for this week. If you have got any queries or questions, feel free to email them in. If there's anything that we can do to help you, there's a link to some free resources in the description below. That's it. I think this one is our last episode before Christmas, so have a fantastic festive break, and we will catch you all in January 2026.